What I want to do this morning is continuing in the next few verses here. Now that Eve and Adam have eaten of this fruit, here comes a pretty big shift, right? Because everything's been good as God has made it, as God has organized it to be. The serpent comes, that's the big twist, right? And then we took a break last week to talk about how Satan lies to us. But now we jump back into the text and what's happened now that man has been lied to, that man has accepted the lie, and that they've eaten of the fruit. Here's what happens. It's the beginning of the ruining of God's paradise, in a sense. And this topic keeps coming back up here. It also keeps coming back up at work every week, because I've mentioned this before, but my boss will say it in the weekly meetings where he says, I don't know why God does this. And every week I'll walk away from that meeting and saying, God is not the reason for that. But this right here is going to be I hate to use this phrase necessarily, but hell on earth. Here comes, because of lies, because of Satan's tactics, because of his ability to deceive and to bring you over to the things he wants you to do. Here comes the reason why people suffer, why there's illness and death, and those sorts of things. And so what we're going to talk about this morning is show some of the results of the consequences of sin that are mentioned specifically in these verses. Because the consequences that are met here by Adam and Eve are still experienced by you, and they are still experienced by me today. And the big takeaway that we need to remember is that sin will always, and I think I've said this recently, sin will always, always, always cost you something. It will always cost you something. And so we're going to look at just a few of the consequences of sin. And then I want to show you in the text here some ways that man tries to deal with their sin. And then we'll talk briefly about how God deals with man's sin. So if we'll actually begin in verse 7, Adam and Eve have disobeyed God. They've eaten the forbidden fruit. And here's the consequences of their actions. Starting off here. Then the eyes of both of them were opened, and they knew that they were naked, and they sewed fig leaves together and made themselves loin coverings. So it's not that they've suddenly become naked, right? Because that would be weird. And also, okay, I don't want to go off the rails here, but could you imagine if every time you sinned, your clothes just vanished? Anyways, they didn't become naked because they ate of the fruit. Yeah, wouldn't that? You'd never sin again, boy, would you?
Not in public.
If that was like, right. If that was God's response to sin, is like, there go your clothes. This is the worst. Anyways, sin is even worse than sudden nakedness. Anyways, they were naked. They've been naked. It's just that now their eyes are opened, which is kind of an interesting way. Both of their eyes are opened. And obviously what that really more is getting at is it's never bothered them before that they were naked. That's just how it was. They were naked. And now they're seeing it, and they're seeing it a different way. And it bothers them. What exactly has changed here? Well, before, they weren't ashamed to be naked, specifically in front of each other. And now they are. And what's happened is they've lost their innocence. I think this is a really good way to show that. And I'm not saying that that their eyes weren't really open and they didn't really change their perception of their nakedness. That really happened. But I think that's the best example of losing your innocence. Being naked in front of, right? They are very well aware of this guilt. They've done something wrong and they know it. And unless a person sears over their conscience, which is possible, then this is something that constantly accompanies sin. Which is scary to think about, that you could sin so much or to such a degree or do it so often that eventually your conscience is just seared and you don't have this anymore. You don't have this shame. And again, we say that sometimes. Some people have no shame, and that's true. Some people have no shame. We could probably go around the room and talk about one of many times that you felt some sort of shame or guilt. First time you got caught, maybe. I was always, for most of my public schooling, which, I mean, I was always in public school, but you know what I mean. Elementary, middle school, I was a good kid. High school, I was a good kid, you know. I wasn't like these other guys, right? But, you know, I was kind of a class clown and that sort of thing. But elementary and middle school, I was a good kid, right? I did my work. I paid attention. I still didn't make good grades. I was kind of dumb. But that doesn't mean that I was goofing off in class. I just, you know, I took good notes. I did my best, right? And I remember in 7th grade, I had we went from Edmond to Deer Creek. Brand new school. Don't know anyone there. Don't know any of the teachers or anything. And I was doing my work, and actually Della and I ran into this guy at Aldi yesterday. We were in our car, and he was in the parking lot. And the man is massive. He's 6'5", just a huge guy. And he used to kind of bully me a little bit, but in a fun way. I don't know. We were buddies, but we weren't. But anyways, he copied off of my homework for a different class. We were both in science, and he was looking off my page, and he said, Dodgen, because that's what you do in high school or middle school. You call each other by your last name. He said, Dodgen, give me your math homework or whatever. And I said, all right. So I gave it to him, because what had happened is it was two-sided, and I had done one side and he had done the other, but we hadn't done. So it was only fair that when he did mine, I said, you know what? Give me your sheet and let me fill out my half that I need to do. And man, the science teacher walked by my desk, and it was the worst feeling in the world for her to just go, I'll take those. I mean, I was in the middle of the act when she pulled those off my desk. We probably all, and that's a light story, right? We all have things where just, man, that moment when you get caught, right? Or it's that feeling of, for me, I was always a good kid, and then I get caught copying homework, and I know that they're probably going to call my dad, and that's not going to go over well when I get home from school. And I'll be super honest with you, because that was 7th grade, and I'm 28 years old now. They didn't call my dad because me and that other student convinced the science teacher, because she hadn't flipped the pages over, that they were two different pieces of math homework and that we weren't copying, and she believed it and gave it back. So it's worse than I copied somebody else's homework, but that I tricked the teacher into not getting me in trouble. And again, I can say I've repented of that long ago. But anyways, we all have our stories, and we know other people have their stories of losing their innocence. Some of them a bit more specific, some of them a little bit more drastic than copying homework. But sin robs you of your innocence. You start feeling this guilt. Guilt, a lot of the time, is extremely heavy, and that's what it is for Adam and Eve here. They've eaten of this fruit. They realize each other's nakedness. Their eyes are open, and man, the guilt is just heavy. We'll come back to what they do, but we're looking at consequences of sin. So here's another one. At verse 10, and he said, I heard the sound of God in the garden, and I was afraid because I was naked. I heard the sound of you in the garden. That's a big consequence of sin, is fear. To be afraid. We get this idea, right, and we can read through Genesis. It isn't uncommon for God to, in a sense, walk in through the garden. And we also get the sense that Adam looked forward to being in the presence of God, right? But now, what we see in verse 10 is Adam was afraid because here comes God. He typically would look forward to being in God's presence, and now he's afraid to be in God's presence. And so that's pretty, widespread for all of us. The fear of meeting God is ultimately, and if you brought this up in an argument or a discussion with an atheist, they'd probably turn this down so fast, but it's true. Fear of meeting God is the main reason why modern man tries to convince himself God doesn't exist. And there's some atheists that are, or agnostics maybe, that are honest enough with themselves to say, I don't believe in God because if God's real, I'm terrified. That has all these implications that I do not want to admit, right? People today want to convince themselves that God doesn't exist because if he does exist, then they're afraid to meet him because they know what they've done. They know what they're doing isn't right. But if he doesn't exist, there's really no consequences outside of you or this person not liking what I've done to you, and who cares, I'll just move on, or you can move on. No fear. And so we convince ourselves that God is not real. But beyond just fear of meeting God, there's also the fear of other people. Right? You do something, you're involved in some sin, well, who's going to know? And will this person find out? Is my husband, is my wife, are my kids, is my boss, are my parents going to find out? And then the ultimate consequence, the third one here, is death. Right? Here in chapter 3, Adam and Eve, this is the kicking off, the beginning to die. When the spirit leaves the body, that's the end of death. But when Adam and Eve disobey God and sin, they begin death. They've set the process in motion. They begin to die, and their sin is ultimately, or would ultimately, result in physical death, which was not a thing and is now a thing. And not only that, but in verse 22 through 24, right, sin is also separation from God in the tree of life, so there's death in that sense as well. So, yes, they surely will die, right? We've talked about that already in past studies through Genesis. You surely will die. They do, in a spiritual sense, separation from God in the tree of life, but also physically, it will ultimately kill them. They are dying. So sin has its consequences, and those are just a few. Those are kind of broad and general, pretty big, stroke of a paintbrush there. But sin will always cost you something. There's fear in sin, and there's death in sin, and there's this tremendous guilt of losing that innocence. But also in this passage, there are three things that man tries to do with his sin, and I think you'll find that you and I try to do these same things. So go back to verse 7. Their eyes are open, and they realize that they're naked, and so they sewed fig leaves together and made themselves loin coverings. And why did they do that? Well, it's not because it suddenly got cold, right? They didn't close themselves because of the public. There's not a great group of people standing around them. They sin, their eyes are opened, this innocence is lost, and so they deal with the shame and the guilt brought on by their sin. They do this to feel better about themselves. God doesn't tell them to cover it up, right? They haven't even, at this point, back in verse 7, they haven't talked to God about this yet, right? Their eyes are open, they see their nakedness, and to make themselves feel better about, okay, well, let's cover this up. It's a physical covering of their parts, but it's also psychological, right? Let's cover that up. And you and I do very much the same thing. We use different things to cover ourselves psychologically and physically. For example, part of the covering psychologically and physically is comparing yourself to other people. We're going to find that in the sermon later this morning. You can feel a sense of shame for something you've done, and you know that probably isn't what I should have done. It's not something a good person does. But I've never done this, and I know a ton of people who have done that. Or I'm not like this guy over here who's been involved in these things. And so, yes, I feel bad about what I've done, and I know that it's a sin, but here's the thing, and something that'll kind of make me feel better, is if I just realize, listen, there are men who have done much worse things. And compared to those guys, I really haven't done much. I haven't really done much. Right? Compared to so-and-so, I'm a saint, right? And all that is that's you psychologically covering up your, that's kind of it's a Band-Aid, right? That doesn't get rid of what you've done, it just makes you feel better. It's just kind of a placebo sort of, mentally cover that up. But another way that we cover ourselves up from sin and shame is, and we don't talk about this one nearly as often, but talking about corporate sin. The church is so apathetic today. A really popular one is, the whole world is just so evil. I might have lied. I might have cheated on my homework, right? I might have copied somebody else's homework. I might have done this. I might have hurt this person. But in the grand scheme, look at what the world's doing, though. And we can spend a lot of time saying, well, look what they're doing with these kids, and they're trying to get them to believe this stuff about their bodies and about their genders and about this sort of thing. And we spend whole lot of focus on talking about corporate sin and all these things that are happening on a grand scale. So that way we have to, we spend zero time talking about what Jeff has done or what Jeff is doing and what Jeff needs to start doing. That's really easy. We don't talk about that we're doing that, but we do that all the time. We do that Sunday mornings. And that's me, right? I'm the preacher, right? I'm the teacher Wednesday nights. We talk about that on Sundays and Wednesdays, where we're not so much talking about you, we're talking about the world and its sin, which is important to talk about, but we oftentimes use that as a big old blanket to cover up what Frank has been doing, what Doug is doing, what you're doing. It's an easy way to cover that up. We will talk about everybody's sin so that we don't have to talk about ours. And that includes bringing in the world, or bringing, the church just isn't doing enough today, and we've got all these problems. It's all it's covering. It's psychological, makes you feel better. It's covering. And if you'll excuse the pun, we're still avoiding the naked truth. But that's how we deal with our shame. We try to cover it up. And then verse 8, here's another one. We also deal with our shame of sin by hiding, which sounds like covering up, but it's different. Verse 8, they hid from the presence of the Lord God among the trees of the garden. Something I want you to focus on. We're going to bring this up twice in two different ways here. And just try to consider this for a moment. Sin doesn't cause God to want to abandon man. Sin doesn't cause God to want to abandon man. Sin causes man to desert God. When you're in the thick of it, if you're sinning or have sinned or whatever it might be, you may not feel that way. Well, God has no relationship with darkness, and so if I go into darkness, well, that's him not wanting a relationship with me, and so really he's left me. No, that's you walking into darkness. Sin causes man to desert God. And we miss that. We misconstrue that from time to time, but here it is in Genesis chapter 3. Does God know that Adam and Eve have done what they've done? Yeah. He already knows. And after they sin, who comes looking for them? Here comes God. He knows they've done it. They've sinned. And it's not that God wants to abandon man. Can you imagine what that would be like? If in Genesis chapter 3, if in Genesis God has created all these things, I'm going to make the world inhabitable for man. He makes man. He gives man free will. He gives man a choice. Don't do this. Don't eat from this tree. Man does that. And then in Genesis chapter 3, we never hear from God again. It's just, and from that point on, man was just calling out to God, and God doesn't say anything, and he used to walk in the garden, but he doesn't anymore, and so Adam and Eve just kind of make their way out and try to make light. That's not what happens. They sin, and the first thing that happens is God comes looking for them. It's God. And what does man do? Man hides. It isn't that our sin makes God abandon us. Our sin causes man to desert God. And so God's coming, man hides. And it's foolish. You and I know that. And Adam and Eve probably knew that to an extent, right? Let me run from God, because if I can hide, then you won't know what I've done. Too late. He already knows, right? But sin causes man to abandon God, and you and I, we do the same stuff. People do the same thing. They want to hide from God. People hide from God by staying in their homes, right? They don't want to be seen. They don't want to go to church. They don't want to fellowship with each other. They don't want people to see. They don't want people to ask questions. Listen, that kind of goes back to the last one with covering up. I don't want you to bring it up. I don't want you to ask me how this or that is going, because it's going to make me start thinking about this and that. Some people hide from God through substances. Right? Again, it kind of comes back to, I don't want to think about these things. I don't want to talk about this stuff. So the more that I drink, or the more that I smoke this or that, or the more that I partake in this, the less that my mind is able to think on those things, and so I don't. And, yeah, Glenn.
Well, I'm just going to say that in Hebrews 10, verse 28, it says, if we go on and willfully sin, there remains no more sacrifice for our sins. So if we willfully sin, he's not wrong.
Absolutely. I think that circles back around a little bit to shearing your conscience. Adam and Eve have sinned. Their consciences are not sheared, right? Here comes God. Versus, going on a tear and saying, I don't care. This is how I want to live. There no longer remains a sacrifice. You're shearing your conscience. There's no shame or guilt. And again, you're abandoning God still in that sense. But, yeah. One of the reasons psychology and philosophy is so popular today is because it's intellectual shrubbery. Joe sent me that article, and I had seen it and scrolled right past it because I didn't care. And then Joe sent it to me, and I said, I guess I'll read it. But it was that guy who, and I'm paraphrasing quite a bit here, so Joe, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but he spent like 40 years with monkeys or something, and he was studying their behavior and studied some of man's behavior as well. But he had come away with the belief, the understanding that man has no free will. Every decision, and I don't know, I feel like even though this is some brand new discovery that this guy's come across, I feel like this has been around, though, this idea that, well, you can't, whatever it is you're doing, the clothes that you put on this morning, the music that you listen to on the way here, the things that you say, the things that you do, you truly have no control. All of that is mathematically determined by what you did yesterday, which was determined by what you did the day before, which is determined by your upbringing, is what happened with mom and dad, or if you were raised by your grandparents, and it's determined by these other things that happened to you that were traumatic, maybe some event that happened to you. But here's the thing, the person that did that traumatic thing to you, they weren't controlling themselves either, because the reason they did that was because of, no one is deciding anything. None of us are. I didn't put these clothes on out of my own free will. I didn't have a choice. It just happened. And that's all intellectual shrubbery to hide behind. But that's why it's so popular, is all these people saying, yes, that's right. We can cover these things up and we can hide what we've done because we can pull up all these things from the past, all these other issues, and hide behind those. It's really foolish. It's not a good idea, even if you can, to play hide and seek with anyone about anything. But it's especially foolish to do that with God. And so instead of hiding, can you imagine again, I'm not trying to rewrite the Bible this morning, but could you imagine again if instead of hiding from God, if Adam and Eve ate of the fruit of that tree, and the first thing they do, their eyes are opened, they see each other's nakedness, and the first thing they do is run to God and say, God, something is wrong. We ate of the fruit of the tree, and now I'm seeing my nakedness, I see her nakedness, and we feel completely different about this. Something just feels way off. Could you imagine if that's what happened instead? They should have run to God because, and man, it's a roundabout way. It's taken a long time, but the only one who can straighten any of this out is going to be God. So imagine if instead of hiding from him, they ran to him first. So if covering doesn't work, and if hiding doesn't work, then what do you do? Well, verse 12. And the man said, the woman that you gave to me, she gave me from the tree, and I ate it. And the Lord God said to the woman, what is this that you've done? And the woman said, the serpent deceived me, and I ate. And again, there's some more of this philosophical, psychological shrubbery here. And this is probably man's favorite way to deal with the sin and the guilt that goes along with it. And that goes along with, do we not have free will, like that guy is saying. And that's blaming. Because, boy, that's easy. That's just right from the hip. The man blames the woman. She handed me the fruit and I ate it. Talk to her. Woman says, the serpent, who I believe you made, okay, deceived me and I ate of it. And man, things really have not changed, and we're really good at blaming, and I'm not trying again to start any trouble here, but everybody is a victim. Or at least everyone truly believes that. Everybody is a victim. I mean, that's not fair for you to tell me that I'm sinning or that this or that is a sin because I'm only doing what I was told. Or you can't hold me, fine, what I did was wrong, but you can't hold me responsible because you don't know what my life has been like. You can't hold me accountable because you don't know what I've been through and the suffering or the abuse that I've endured. Something that I've learned recently and that I've been pondering, and it's just kind of slowly shown up in other parts of my life lately, is this idea of you can explain behavior, but it doesn't excuse it. I think it's perfectly fine for you to say, listen, I do this because mom, because dad, because this experience that I had, because whatever. You can certainly explain your behavior, and that's necessary, I think, to lay that out and say, okay, this is why I do this. Here's the explanation. What we tend to do is take that and then excuse it. And that's why I do this. And if you have a problem with that, get out. You can't, even if I will agree with you, okay, yes, I see the issue with that, that's wrong of me to do, but I have a reason for it, it's explainable, and so it's excusable. That's not true. It's not true. We want to blame everything on someone else. And do you know who gets the most of that blame? God. God does. Adam says, God, you gave me the woman. And Eve says, it's the serpent, but right along with that is one of your creations deceived me. And I, maybe we do that sometimes. God, it's your fault. you didn't answer my prayer, or you didn't answer it the way that I would have liked you to. And if you would have healed my cancer, if you would have gotten me that job, if you would have changed my boss, if you wouldn't have brought that woman into the office, I wouldn't have even known her, and I wouldn't have even gone up to her to get to know her. I wouldn't be where I am now. Really good at blaming. And the sad thing is, blaming others opens the door for justifying more sinful behavior. Because if the last thing you did wasn't your fault, why would the next thing? I haven't sinned yet. Everything you've done has been somebody else's fault. So really, you've got a clean slate still. I don't think anyone would say that out loud. That sounds ridiculous, but that's what we do. Well, yeah, I've done that stuff, but that was a result of somebody else. So really, I haven't, out of my own volition, gone and done this. And so we try to cover our sin. We tried to hide our sin from God. We blame others. And yet, we all know that all of our attempts to deal with our sin, it's woefully inadequate. It's not working. And our refusal to admit the truth about God, and more specifically about ourselves, just leads to more tragic consequences. And so the only effective remedy for sin has to come from God. And we're running out of time pretty quickly here, but that's what makes Genesis chapter 3 incredibly important, is because if we can learn how God responds when Adam and Eve sin, then we can have a pretty good idea of how God is going to respond when you sin, when you disobey, and when you rebel. And so the first thing, really quickly, we'll go through these. The first thing I want you to notice is God came looking for the man, but where was Satan? Where's the serpent? Something is going to be said in regards to the serpent here in a moment. So you might say, well, he's nearby. Sure. Satan abandons them. He doesn't speak up for them. Right? Where are you? What's happening? And Adam says, look, the woman you gave me this fruit. And then Eve says, it was the serpent that you made. And then we don't see the serpent say, okay, everybody, here's what happened. He's not there. He's not saying anything. He doesn't try to defend them. He doesn't try to rescue them and say, oh, God, hey, listen, I can explain what's going on here, God. How about you and I go have a walk? That doesn't happen. Adam and Eve are scrambling to talk to God and say, look, you gave the woman to me. And she says, well, the serpent was the one who deceived me. And they've covered themselves, and they're trying to hide it, and they're trying to... When trouble came, it's God who shows up looking for the man. We talked about Sunday night, and that's going to be the starting point for our sermon this morning. But we talked Sunday night about the God who runs. Because God runs. God comes to you. And that's interesting because if you study a lot of the other religions out there, they all have man looking for God. But the God of the Bible took initiative when it comes to salvation because he's the only one who could do anything. What separates the God of the Bible from all the other gods that men worship is you have to go and find their gods. But the God comes to you. And he approaches you not in a spirit of contempt, but in a spirit of concern. He loves Adam and Eve still, very much so in spite of their sin and in spite of their attempts to flush them out. And so he asks the question, God doesn't just, again, we would call that ghosting, right? God doesn't just suddenly quit talking to them. That's not what Genesis chapter 3 says. And God, it's not just suddenly Adam and Eve, their eyes were opened, they were naked, and they were thousands of miles away that direction. And have never been here before. They're still in the garden. None of that happens. What happens is God comes to them and he asks them a question, where are you? And again, God knows where they are, but he asks them that question for their benefit. God asks, where are you? And what he's really asking is, why are you where you are? Why are you hiding from me? Why are you afraid of me? Why do you feel so bad? And what God wanted from them is what he wants from us today. And it's for us to come to terms with the truth about sin. Again, can you imagine if Adam and Eve had run to God instead of hiding? Come out here. Let's get it out in the open. Let's talk about this. Let's work on God is saying, come out here and let's work on this. But instead, Adam and Eve do what a lot of people do today. They cover it up, they try to hide, and they blame someone else. And that's just where it starts. Because eventually you will have to, and it might be too late, but if you can do it now, you can come to terms with the truth about sin, and then God can straighten it out. But the longer you wait to do that, the less time God's going to have to straighten it out for you. Man, we're nearly out of time. Hold on just a sec. How does God do that? Verse 15, it says it right here. Here's the remedy. It's clear back in Genesis chapter 3, verse 15. I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your seed and her seed. He shall bruise you on the head, and you shall bruise him on the heel. And what God essentially is saying is, right here to Adam and Eve, he says, someone is going to come who is going to crush the serpent's head. And then you get to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and all of them are saying, here he is, here he is, here he is. And then as you read through the Gospels, you see where Jesus defeats Satan, right? You get to the end of those books, and Jesus dies. And you think, oh no, who is going to defeat Satan now? But then Jesus is raised from the dead, and what you realize is the serpent bruises Christ's heel on the cross. Jesus is raised from the dead. He's defeated sin. He's defeated death. Remember, Hebrews chapter 2, verse 14, he removes the power of death from Satan, crushes his head. He gets his heel bruised, and then Jesus crushes his head. The crucified and raised Christ is God's remedy for sin. That's how God is going to deal with it. And what do we do with sin? We cover it up, but we can't, or the longer you cover it up as opposed to getting it out in the open, God's not going to help you with that. Do we hide it? No, because again, you can only do that for so long. You need to get it out into the open so that you and God can deal with it. Do we blame it on other people? No, because God can't cover your sin as long as you're covering it, hiding it, and blaming it on somebody else. It's good to get the explanation out there to explain the behavior. It doesn't excuse it, but you can explain it, and then you get it out into the open, and then you and God work on truly getting rid of it. And the only way that God can cover your sin is if you get it out there. Right? It's coming forward and confessing those sins. It's talking to your brother and sister and confessing those things. It's just praying to God. As a Christian, praying to God and confessing those things and asking for forgiveness for that stuff. It's not pleasant. But the longer you cover it up, the longer you hide, the longer you blame it on someone else, you're prolonging the inevitable and you're making it worse. I don't know. That's all I've got this morning, unless there's any thoughts or questions or anything. Glenn?
Well, I was just going to say, correct me if I'm wrong, but it reminded me of Revelations when we studied about eating the book and it's sweet in your mouth, and it's bitter in your stomach.
Yeah.
And then when you try to live up to that, and it's bitter in your stomach, to me that's an honest Christian. It's bothering you, you know.
Yeah.
You got to get it right. Just made me think of that.
For sure. Absolutely. All right. Thanks, guys.